Introduction: How to study anatomy. Descriptive anatomic terms. Anterior and posterior are the anatomic terms for front and back. Sometimes the terms ventral and dorsal are used to depict anterior and posterior, but these terms are usually applied to quadrupeds. Anatomic position is that position of the body, facing forward with palms forward, from which the position of all structures are described. Cranial or superior and caudal or inferior are terms applied to headward and tailward. Descriptive anatomic terms. Horizontal or transverse plane is a plane at right angles to the sagittal plane. Medial and lateral are terms used to describe positions relative to the midline of the body. For example, a structure located closer to the midline than another structure is described as being medial to it, or, if farther away, lateral to it. Median plane or mid-sagittal plane is a plane through the midline of the body from anterior to posterior. Any plane that passes parallel to this plane is called a sagittal plane. Anatomic variation. Mesial and distal are terms that relate to tooth locations that are described from the median plane. Thus, canine teeth are mesial to premolar teeth, whereas molar teeth are distal to premolar teeth. Proximal and distal are positions relative to the body. For example, the elbow is proximal to the wrist, whereas the fingers are distal to the wrist. Superficial and deep are self-explanatory. Example: skin is superficial to muscle, whereas the heart is deep to the lungs. Alternate terms for superficial and deep are external and internal. Four major categories of anatomy study include developmental anatomy, neuroanatomy, microscopic anatomy, and macroscopic anatomy. The science of human anatomy is generally divided into four major categories of study. Developmental anatomy, commonly referred to as human embryology, deals with the study of how the mature body is formed, beginning with a fertilized ovum. Neuroanatomy is the specialized study of the nervous system, including that of the brain and spinal cord. Microscopic anatomy is the division of anatomy that studies the fine details of the human body using the microscope. This division is more commonly referred to as histology, the study of tissues. Macroscopic or gross anatomy, on the other hand, is that division of anatomy that studies the human body with the unaided eye. Gross anatomy. Gross anatomy is the study of the human body with the unaided eye, and it may be studied systemically or regionally. Gross anatomy of the human body may be studied from one of two approaches. Systemic anatomy is the approach that describes and discusses each system separately and in its entirety, example: studying all of the muscles of the body that compose the muscular system before discussing the components of any other system. Regional anatomy. Regional anatomy confines itself to a particular region of the body without extending the study outside the region. Regional anatomy details a region of the body, such as the head and neck, studying all systems in that area as a complete, integrated unit. The regional approach used in this text provides the student with a more comprehensive presentation of an anatomic region, thus enhancing an understanding of interrelationships between the various systems of the body. Human anatomic terms are spatially related to the anatomic position defined as erect with the palms facing forward. Human anatomic structures are described spatially relative to the anatomic position, defined for the human as an erect position with the palms of the hands facing forward. Structures on the front side of the body are described as being anterior, whereas those on the back of the body are termed posterior. Occasionally, other terms may be used for anterior and posterior, such as ventral in place of anterior and dorsal in place of posterior. The terms ventral and dorsal are perhaps more appropriate when related to quadrupeds, although embryologists and neuroanatomists prefer these terms. Similarly, alternate terms may be used in referring to directions aimed at the head or tail. Cranial or superior means toward the head, whereas caudal or inferior refers to tailward, although neuroanatomists prefer the term rostral for cranial or superior. The terms superficial and deep are used to describe positions relative to the surface of the body from any aspect. The ribs are superficial to the lungs but deep to the skin. Alternate terms for superficial and deep are external and internal, respectively. Proximal and distal are terms generally applied to positions close to or away from the body, respectively. For example, the wrist is proximal to the finger but distal to the elbow. The teeth are described as being either mesial or distal to each other in the dental arch from the median plane of the face. For example, the canine tooth is mesial to the first premolar and distal to the lateral incisor. Medial and lateral are terms applied in relationship to the midline of the body. A structure, A, located closer to the midline than another structure, B, is therefore medial to structure B. An anatomy student must also learn to visualize several imaginary planes passing through the body serving to divide it in one way or another. The median plane passes vertically through the body from anterior to posterior at the midline. This plane divides the body into symmetric right and left halves, except for certain areas of the viscera. This plane may also be referred to as the mid-sagittal plane. Any plane parallel to this plane is simply a sagittal plane. A plane through the body at right angles to the mid-sagittal plane is the horizontal or transverse plane, providing a cross-section with superior and inferior parts. Another plane passes at right angles to the mid-sagittal plane, again in a vertical direction, and is the frontal or coronal plane, dividing the body into anterior and posterior sections. Although the previously described terms are applied to the entire body, they are also appropriately used in describing the structures in head and neck anatomy. Anatomic variation is often the rule rather than the exception, and the student must learn to recognize and interpret its significance. A student of anatomy must learn early that anatomic variation is frequently the rule rather than the exception. Structures observed in the cadaver often do not conform to the descriptions found in anatomy textbooks. The major structures might not vary so much, but, as the finer details are studied, variations clearly emerge. For example, a student would not expect great variation in the number of bones present in a cadaver, and the variation is not great. However, the individual processes on the bones and their relationships are not at all constant from one individual to another. Similarly, muscles might display slightly different origins, insertions, and tendons. Nerves might not arise from the segment as described. Variations in blood supply are common, thus, a particular region might be supplied from an entirely different source than that described. It is important that the student learn to recognize anatomic variations as they exist, whether or not they are described. Furthermore, the student must learn to interpret logically the significance of these variations and perhaps to extrapolate their effects on the living individual. Mastering this diagnostic technique helps enable the professional to make rational decisions regarding anatomic variations observed in clinical practice. Autonomic nervous system is an involuntary, visceral, motor system serving smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. Cardiovascular system is composed of the heart, arteries, capillaries, veins, and the blood. The two-pump heart circulates blood through the pulmonary circuit to oxygenate the blood and to rid it of carbon dioxide, and it pumps the oxygen-rich blood in the systemic circuit to the remainder of the body. Additionally, the cardiovascular system transports water, hormones, and nutritive materials and exchanges these for waste and carbon dioxide, which it will deliver for elimination. Most of these exchanges take place in the capillary beds within the tissues. Endochondral bone formation is a method of bone development where bone forms on a cartilage model which it eventually replaces. Enteric nervous system is the third division of the autonomic system, located wholly within the wall of the alimentary canal. It functions in regulating the process of digestion. The enteric nervous system is composed of about the same number of neurons as are present in the spinal cord. Although the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems exercise a modulating effect on the enteric nervous system, it can function on its own if the connections are severed. Integument includes the skin, hair, nails, and glands. Intramembranous bone formation is a method of bone development where the bone forms within the surrounding mesenchyme. Muscle usually spans across a joint from a bony origin on one side of the joint to insert upon a bone making up the other side of the joint. Contraction of the muscle, which is controlled by nerve stimulation, will alter the angle of the joint. Some muscles, such as those of the facial expression, originate and insert in connective tissue proper rather than bone. Parasympathetic nervous system is a division of the autonomic nervous system composed of a two-neuron chain originating in either the brain or sacral spinal cord and synapsing with the second neuron within an autonomic ganglion. This second neuron innervates the effector organs, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The parasympathetic nervous system is calming as it returns the body to a homeostatic state. Skeleton is composed of bone whose articular ends are usually covered with cartilage to absorb shock and reduce friction. The skeleton is made up of a series of bones comprising the axial skeleton and others comprising the appendicular skeleton. Sympathetic nervous system is a division of the autonomic nervous system composed of a two-neuron chain originating in the thoracic and first two or three lumbar spinal cord segments and synapsing with the second neuron within an autonomic ganglion. This second neuron innervates the effector organs, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The sympathetic system provides for the fight or flight response. Human beings, just as all other animals, are composed of a complex aggregate of specialized cells. These cells, the building blocks of all living things, have become specialized to perform certain functions, a division of labor. Cells are organized into tissues, organs, and organ systems based on their specializations relative to structure and function. Because structure and function are interrelated, it is possible to group these cells and the material they export into the extracellular spaces into functional classifications based on morphologic features. Similar specialized cells organized to perform a specific role are grouped into tissues. Thus, the cell classifications of epithelium, connective tissue, muscle, and nerve represent all of the specializations relative to structure and function. Tissues fabricated together and performing in unison to accomplish a particular function make up an organ. Organs acting together to accomplish specific functionary roles are referred to as organ systems. Thus, the body possesses a myriad of cells organized into tissues and organs performing together as the integumentary, skeletal, muscular, circulatory, endocrine, digestive, respiratory, excretory, reproductive, and nervous systems. Although it is not the purpose of this text to detail the systems of the body, it is nevertheless essential that students possess a satisfactory knowledge of the systems encountered in the head and neck. By learning or reviewing a brief overview of each of these systems, students will reach a common starting point for studying the anatomy of the head and neck. Tibia, to cartilage of the ear, and over joints of the fingers and the palm of the hand. Skin color is primarily controlled by three factors: blood, keratin, and melanin. Variation in color is related to degree of vascularity, oxygen content of blood, skin thickness, and profuseness of pigmentation. Under certain conditions, physiologic changes may produce a transient increase in pigmentation, as evidenced in the tanning process from exposure to sunlight. The external genital areas, the axilla, and the areola of the mammary gland display constantly deeper pigmentation. Skin possesses fine furrows or creases extending in various directions across its surface. These furrows tend to divide the surface into polygonal areas. Some of these areas are large, whereas others, e.g., on the back of the hand, are small. Epidermal ridges and sulci, furrows, on the fingers, palms, and solace are organized in a specialized fashion of whorls and curves peculiar to each individual. This particular uniqueness provides the basis for fingerprint identification. Epidermal ridges provide friction against slippage in walking and in grasping. Ducts of sweat glands open on the summits of the ridges, whereas in areas covered with hair, the shafts emerge at points of intersection of the furrows. Typically, the secretions of the sebaceous glands empty in the furrows also. Structure: skin. Skin is composed of the epidermis, which is made up of the avascular epidermis, a stratified squamous keratinized epithelium, as well as the underlying connective tissue, known as the dermis, which houses blood vessels, nerve endings, connective tissue, sebaceous and sweat glands, hair follicles, and smooth muscles. Skin is composed of two layers, the epidermis, or surface layer, and the underlying dermis. The epidermis is without blood vessels but is penetrated by sensory nerve endings. In general, the epidermis is only about 1 mm thick and is composed of several layers of stratified squamous epithelial cells. Histologists have subdivided these layers into 5 distinct groups based on morphologic features and function. The deepest layer, the stratum basale, formerly known as the stratum germinativum, overlays the dermis and is primarily responsible for producing all of the epidermal cells above it, which are being shed constantly. As these cells mature, they produce keratohyalin, which is eventually transformed into keratin in the superficial layers. The most superficial layer, the stratum corneum, is composed of dead cells and keratin and forms a horny layer whose thickness is related to the trauma it experiences. The dermis underlying the epidermis possesses the blood supply, lymphatic channels, and nerve endings. It also contains sebaceous and sweat glands, hair follicles, and the smooth muscles of the skin. The interface of the epidermis and dermis is thrown into interdigitations of epidermal ridges and dermal ridges, dermal papillal, which serve to secure the two layers. The dermis is composed of 2 basic layers, a superficial papillary layer and the deeper reticular layer containing collagenous and elastic fibers, which account for its strength and elasticity. The deepest layer of the dermis sits on a subcutaneous connective tissue layer. The interface of these 2 layers is somewhat interdigitated so that when the layers are separated from each other the dermal side appears to exhibit a dimpled appearance similar to an orange peel. These dimples are sites of entry for nerves and blood vessels into the skin from the subcutaneous connective tissue. The subcutaneous connective tissue, hypodermis, is a loose, fibrous connective tissue containing fat and some elastic fibers. It may be termed loose areolar tissue or superficial fascia. Some areas of the body possess large deposits of fat in this layer and are designated panniculus adiposus. Certain other areas, notably the eyelids, penis, and scrotum, as well as the nipple and areola of the mammary gland, are devoid of subcutaneous fat. Embedded in this layer are the roots of the hair follicles, blood vessels, secretory portions of the sweat glands, and nerves with special sensory endings for pressure. Overlying some joints, the hypodermis contains bursae, which are fluid-filled sacs that provide lubrication for movement of the skin as the joint is flexed. Many mammals, such as the horse, possess voluntary muscles in the hypodermis that permit flinching of the skin. Muscles of this nature, originating in the hypodermis and inserting in the dermis, are present in the scalp, face, and neck. Here they are grouped in humans as the muscles of facial expression. Involuntary, smooth, muscles are also represented in this layer, muscles such as the dartus muscle of the scrotum and the muscles of the nipple and areola of the mammary gland. Hair is found in nearly all places on the body except the palms, the soles, and a few other places. If hair is straight, its cross-sectional shape is round; if hair is curly, its cross-section is flattened. Hair is found on nearly all parts of the body with the exception of the palms, the soles, the dorsum of the terminal digits, the nipples, the umbilicus, and the skin portion of the genitalia. Hair is also absent in areas of skin that are transitional to mucous membrane, such as the lips and nares. The cross-section of hair may be round, causing it to be straight, or it may be flattened, producing curly hair. The eyelashes, hair of the pubic region, and hair in the beard are very thick, whereas in other areas of the body it may be so thin that it may go unnoticed. Hair on the scalp may remain for up to 4 years, whereas the eyelashes may survive only for a few months. Hair is a product of the epidermis, whose deeper cells invade the dermis and form a hair follicle from which the non-living hair develops. The dermis responds by forming a papilla to nourish the regenerative cells of the follicle. Thereafter, the hair grows surfaceward, finally exiting the skin. The free part of the hair is called the shaft, and that within the follicle is the root. Color is imparted to the hair by melanin and red pigment in the hair cells. Each hair has in association with it one or more sebaceous glands, whose ducts open into the neck of the hair follicle. Involuntary muscle fibers, erector pili, arise in the dermis and attach to the hair follicle, serving to erect the hair, squeezing out the secretions of the sebaceous glands and producing goosebumps on the flesh. Nails. Nails are composed of highly keratinized epithelial cells that form nail plates at the distal ends of the terminal digits. The nails, which grow approximately 1 mm per week, are modifications of epidermal cell layers on the terminal digits. It should be noted that toenails grow at a slower rate. The vascular nail bed, formed by the lower germinal layer of the epidermis and the dermis, on which lies the translucent nail plate, imparts a pinkish hue to the nail. The visible part of the nail is the body and the hidden portion behind the nail wall is the root. The nail is formed in the proximal part near the whitened lunula, which may be covered by eponychium, cuticle. The epidermis is thickened under the distal portion of the nail, forming the hyponychium. Glands. Glands of the skin include sweat glands, sebaceous glands, and the mammary glands, modified sweat glands. Glands of the skin include the sebaceous glands, the sweat glands, and the mammary glands. The last will not be discussed in this text because they are remote to the head and neck. The sebaceous glands have been described in their association with hair follicles, but there are non-functional sebaceous glands, known as Fordyce granules, located in regions of the body devoid of hair, namely, the lips, the corners of the mouth, and sometimes within the oral cavity. In addition, these glands may be found in most areas of the genitalia as well as the areola and nipple. The secretory cells are constantly destroyed and become part of the oily secretion sebum, which protects the skin and hair from undue drying. Sweat glands are widely distributed, being absent only from the lips, parts of the ear, the skin of the nipple, and some skin areas of the genitalia. Sweat glands are most dense over the palms and soles. The clear, noncellular fluid produced by the sweat glands regulates body temperature as it evaporates from the surface of the skin, cooling it. The muscular system is composed of specialized cells that have the capacity to contract, which permits movement. There are three types of muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Cells specialized to function in contraction on stimulation comprise the muscles of the body. Skeletal muscles are usually attached from bone to bone, across a joint. On contraction, muscles change the angle of the joint, producing motion. In this way, muscles acting in concert, effect movement. Such motion may be under conscious control, voluntary, or not under conscious control, involuntary. Muscles that affect smiling, walking, writing, and so on are voluntary muscles, whereas those used in altering the diameter of blood vessels or controlling the bowel are in the involuntary category. The body has three types of muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. The first two are striated and the last is not. Skeletal muscle is under voluntary control, whereas cardiac and smooth muscles are involuntary. Structure: the contractile elements are the myofibrils composed of actin and myosin, whose organization makes the skeletal and cardiac muscle cells appear striated, whereas smooth muscle cells do not exhibit striations. Microscopically, the muscle cell is referred to as a muscle fiber. The cytoplasm of skeletal and cardiac muscle cells contains many contract 1Le elements called myofibrils, which are composed of actin and myosin. The fibril arrangement in these muscles is such that the muscle fiber appears to be cross-banded in alternate light and dark striations. This appearance is responsible for the name striated muscle. Skeletal muscle fibers are long, cylindrical, multinucleated cells whose nuclei are located peripherally. Smooth and cardiac muscle cells, in contrast, each possess only one centrally located nucleus. Microscopic evaluation reveals no striations within the integumentary system is composed of the skin and its derivatives, including the hair, nails, and glands. The integument, or skin, includes its derivatives the hair, nails, and glands. It functions to protect the underlying structures against intrusion from the outside and from loss from within. Furthermore, it serves as a sensory receptor, a body temperature regulator, and an organ of secretion and excretion. Skin: the skin covers the body except where it becomes continuous with the mucous membranes at the orifices of the body. It possesses many specializations in different regions of the body. The skin forms a pliable covering over the body and becomes continuous with mucous membranes at the orifices of the body, as at the anus, urethra, vagina, nares, and the oral cavity. The skin is thickest over the back, the palm of the hand, and the sole of the foot, where it is about 6 mm thick. The thinnest skin, which overlays the tympanic membrane and the eyelid, is about 0.5 mm thick. In most areas of the body the skin is loosely attached to the underlying structures, thus permitting it to be easily displaced. It is, however, firmly attached to the periosteum of the cytoplasm of smooth muscle cells. Smooth muscle is involuntary, non-striated, and contains a central nucleus. The smooth muscle is a non-striated, fusiform muscle containing a centrally placed nucleus. This involuntary muscle is the contractile element in vessel walls and the wall of the viscera, where it tons longitudinal and circular layers reinforcing viscera. Contraction of this layers in the gastrointestinal tract, GI, tract are responsible for peristalsis. Each hair of the skin possesses a smooth muscle attached at its base. Contractions of these muscles causes goose flesh because smooth muscle is involuntary, it is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. Cardiac muscle is found in the heart. LT is striated and branched and joins to form intercalated discs. Each cell possesses a centrally placed nucleus. Cardiac muscle is found mostly in the muscular pump, the heart. Cardiac muscle fibers are striated in a fashion similar to skeletal muscle cells, but each cell possesses only one centrally located nucleus. Features unique to cardiac muscle are its branching and its anastomosing, or joining together, of the cells, and its transversely oriented intercalated discs, located at the junction of any two fibers. This muscle type is unique in that it possesses an ability to modify its contractive actions by altering the wave of impulses received from the nervous system. Skeletal muscle is the most abundant muscles. Skeletal muscles is voluntary muscle and highly striated. The cells are very large and multinucleated. Skeletal muscle is responsible for body movements. Skeletal muscle is by far the most abundant muscle in the body. It comprises 40% of total body weight. Its size varies from the large muscles of the leg to the very small stapedius muscle, only about 2 mm long, which is attached to tiny stapes bone of the middle ear cavity. Each skeletal muscle fiber is encased in a thin connective tissue covering, the endomysium. A muscle fascicle, composed of a group of muscle fibers, is bundled into a separate connective tissue sheath, the perimysium. The entire muscle, composed of many fasciculi, is wrapped in yet another connective tissue sheath, termed the epimysium or deep fascia. Attachment: the connective tissue coverings of muscle fibers attach to bone via tendons. A flattened attachment such as is present on the skull is termed aponeurosis. Bursae form around the attachment of some tendons, providing lubrication, reduction of frictional forces, and protection. At the attachment to bone, the endomysium, along with the epimysium and perimysium, merge to form the tendon, a dense, regular, collagenous connective tissue, silvery white in color. Tendons are extremely strong and at their attachment site on bone the periosteum is absent. In certain regions of the body, such as in the muscles of the scalp, attachment is by an aponeurosis, a broad, flat, sheet-like structure, instead of a tendon. Some attachments are provided with bursae, which lubricate the tendon as it passes over bone. Often a synovial sheath encloses a tendon, forming a tubular sac that is capable of secreting a synovial fluid, which functions to reduce friction. Friction is also reduced by the epimysium, the deep fascia of the body. Because the deep fascia encloses muscles and bone in a continuous manner, it also serves to contain the spread of infection. Tendinous attachments to bone are usually described as the origin and insertion of the muscle. Generally, the muscle is described as arising from the origin, possessing a fleshy belly, the contractive portion, and inserting at the insertion site. The origin is usually the more proximal and/or fixed area, with the insertion being the more distal or movable area. Movement is usually described relative to the muscle insertion position moving toward the origin while the body is in the anatomic position. It must be stressed that these are not inviolate rules but, rather, are arbitrarily used by anatomists as aids in describing function. These rules are especially difficult to apply in the head and neck, thus, learning muscle functions in this region of the body is painstaking. Although the previous description of bone-to-bone origin and insertion is the usual occurrence, the muscles of facial expression do not follow this rule. Generally, these muscles arise from bone or fascia and insert into the skin of the face. On contraction, they produce movements of the skin that we recognize as facial expressions. Form, muscle size, form, and fiber arrangement is indicative of its power and direction of the movement it produces across a joint. Examining a muscle's size, form, and fiber arrangement in relation to its insertion into the tendon will indicate the relative strength of the muscle as well as the direction of its force. Muscle fibers that approach the tendon in an oblique fashion afford more power. Muscles whose anatomy takes this form are pennate. Fibers entering a tendon at two oblique angles, as do the veins of a feather, are said to be bipinnate. Multiples of this architectural arrangement produce two, which exhibit the greatest strength. Action, terms employed to describe muscle action are not easily applied to all movements. However, most are intuitive, such as flexion and extension across a joint and adductors and abductors moving things toward or away from the midline. Actions about the head and neck are protrusion, retraction, elevation, rotation, and depression. Muscle action is described according to the movement effected in the part in motion from the anatomic position. Although individual actions are often difficult to separate given the complexities of a variable motion as, for example, in mandibular movement they are expressed in a few anatomic terms. Flexion is described as motion that reduces the angle of a joint, whereas extension increases the joint angle. Making a fist uses the flexor muscles, opening a closed fist uses the extensor muscles. Adduction and abduction describe motion toward and away from the body center line, respectively. Terms describing movements of the head and neck protrusion, retraction, elevation, rotation, and depression are self-explanatory. Several other terms are used to describe various other motions created by the action of a muscle, however, because these are of no concern to the study of the head and neck, their discussion will be omitted here. Often, names assigned to muscles reflect the architecture of the muscle, its form or shape, its attachments and action, or, in some cases, a combination of these features. However, seldom does a muscle function independently. Indeed, movements are so complex that muscles must function in a cooperative and integrated manner to accomplish a total desired movement. To recognize this complexity, anatomists have created additional terms that indicate how a muscle functions in producing a total movement. Muscles may be prime movers or synergists, which assist a prime mover. Certain other muscles, such as the strap muscles attached to the hyoid bone, serve as fixators, so that other actions may be initiated by yet other muscles. Antagonists function in such a manner that the action they develop is in opposition to the desired function of yet other muscles, agonists. In addition to aiding in the production of smooth movement, antagonists protect the musculoskeletal system from damaging itself, as might occur through a violent movement. Nerve control. Voluntary muscle contraction is controlled by nerves that interact with the muscle fibers at the motor end plate, stimulating the muscle fiber to contract. Other nerve fibers enter the muscle to relay sensory and proprioceptive information back to the central nervous system. Voluntary muscles must receive nerve stimulation to contract. The number of nerve fibers in a muscle depends on the muscle size and the degree of control required of the muscle. The extrinsic muscles of the eye, for instance, are well endowed with nerve fibers, whereas the muscles of the back possess fewer nerve endings. As the nerve fiber approaches the muscle, it branches to innervate many muscle fibers. The motor end plate is that part of the muscle fiber's cell membrane where the nerve fiber forms a synapse with the muscle cell and the impulse is transmitted. In addition to this nerve fiber, which serves a motor function, other fibers enter the muscle, which will conduct sensations of pain and proprioception from the muscle and surrounding connective tissue back to the central nervous system, CNS. These nerves provide sensory data to the CNS so the motor function may be reprogrammed either voluntarily or involuntarily, as might be necessary for the individual to take protective measures. When a muscle fiber is stimulated, it contracts maximally according to the law of all or none. It holds, then, that fine movements are accomplished by stimulating fewer nerve fibers, resulting in activation of only a portion of the total muscle fibers at a given time. Energy requirements necessary for the work performed by the muscles demand a rich vascular supply. It is a general rule throughout the entire body that nerves and blood vessels travel together as neurovascular bundles, are named alike, and enter the muscle together. Larger muscles, requiring additional vascularization, may have additional arteries entering their surfaces without associated nerves. In such cases, the artery usually arises from a nearby vascular trunk. Whereas nerve supply to a muscle is specific, vascular supply might not be, therefore, vascular supply is provided by region. Bone and cartilage are specialized connective tissues that make up the skeletal system. As a system they perform many functions, including protection, attachment for muscles, leverage, mineral storage, and blood formation. The elements of the skeletal system, bone, cartilage, and the joints are composed of intercellular materials and cells specialized in performing certain functions for the body. Functions unique to the system include support, protection, providing attachment for muscles, leverage, mineral storage, and blood formation. Support is derived from the mineral salts that are deposited in the matrix and fibers secreted by the cells of the system. Through this process, the skeletal system provides form and a framework on which all of the remaining systems of the body are supported and held together. Protection is afforded to the soft tissues of the body, including the viscera, lungs, and brain, by encasing them in partially enclosed structures, such as the rib cage and pelvis, or in an enclosed chamber, the skull. The skeletal system also provides sites of attachment for skeletal muscles along the bones and across the joints. The various parts of the skeletal system then can be used as levers for the production of motion as a result of muscle contraction. In addition to their function in providing leverage, bones become calcified by mineral deposits during development and growth and, therefore, serve as reservoirs for mineral storage. The predominant minerals stored are calcium, magnesium, and phosphate. A final major function of the skeletal system is blood cell formation. The interiors of most bones, including the epiphyses of long bones, flat, irregular, and short bones, house bone marrow, whose specialized cells have the capacity of differentiating and maturing into circulating blood cells. Although the liver and spleen are active in blood cell production prenatally, they cease this function prior to birth. Thus, after birth, bone marrow becomes the principal site of blood cell production. Skeleton. The bony skeleton is composed of 206 bones divided into an axial and appendicular skeleton. The skeletal system, composed of 206 bones, is divided into the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton according to the following distribution. This number is not constant because slight variations can exist among individuals. Many bones do not fuse together until after infancy, therefore, infants possess more bones than adults. Occasionally, some skull bones, which develop as bilateral halves, do not fuse in the midline, thus remaining doubled. The frontal bone is one example of this phenomenon, in some cases remaining divided into two separate bones at the metopic suture instead of fusing at the midline. Accessory bones might also develop in bones possessing multiple ossification centers that fail to unite. This condition gives rise to Wormian bones, often observed in the larger flat bones of the skull. Sesamoid bones develop within tendons either for additional leverage, as in the patella, kneecap, or as a means of reducing friction at the joint. Several of these bones may be present, but again the number varies among individuals. The axial skeleton comprises the bones making up the longitudinal axis and protects the spinal cord, brain, and vital organs. It also supports the head and neck, along with the trunk and its appendages. A major part of this portion of the skeleton is the skull, composed of many bones more or less tightly sutured together forming the cranial vault to protect the brain, as well as bones forming the face. The mandible and bony ossicles of the ear are bones that are separate from the skull proper, but they are still considered part of the skull. Although the hyoid bone does not articulate with the skull, it is occasionally listed as part of the skull because of its functional association. The vertebral column is the major foundation of the skeleton and protects the spinal cord. Attached to the vertebral column are the ribs, which enclose and protect the lungs and heart and attach anteriorly to the medial, anteriorly placed sternum. The 5 fused sacral vertebrae and 4 coccyx form part of the pelvis, serving to protect the pelvic viscera. These last 9 constitute the remaining components of the axial skeleton. The appendicular skeleton, composed of some 126 bones, makes up the remaining skeletal system. The bones of the superior extremity include those of the hand, arm, and pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle attaches the bones of the superior extremity to the axial skeleton. The inferior extremity includes the bones forming the foot and leg and the pelvic girdle. Here the pelvic girdle attaches the extremity to the axial skeleton. Bone classification. Bones are classified according to their shape: long, short, flat, irregular, and sesamoid bones. Bones may be classified on the basis of their general shape. These shapes include long bones, as found in the arms and legs, short bones, as in the wrist and ankle, flat bones, like those forming the skull, and irregular bones, such as the vertebrae. Sesamoid bones are also described as a separate category. Bone is a composite of cells and organic matrix secreted by bone cells with deposited inorganic salts crystallized within the matrix. This complex organization produces a lightweight structure with a great tensile strength and the ability to withstand compression. The tubular design of long bones, consisting of a thin layer of compact bone external to spongy bone with its trabeculae, increases the structural strength of the bone. The articular ends of bones usually covered by the articular cartilage are designated as condyles or heads. The shaft of the bone may possess several characteristic landmarks indicating much information. Terms used to describe these features include smooth areas, indicating a periosteum cover only, elevations, in the form of lines, crests, ridges, processes, tuberces, tuberosities, and spines, indicating points of attachments, depressions, such as pits, foveae, and fossae, indicating intervals between elevations or sites where a structure may be housed, grooves and sulci, indicating linear depressions housing particular structures, foramina and notches, indicating openings or holes, and canals. Or meat uses, indicating passageways or tunnels. Joints. Joints are formed when 2 or more bones come together. They may be classified as fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial, depending on the makeup of the union components. 2 or more bones coming together form a joint. Sometimes the union is such that movement is prevented, whereas in other instances movement is the function of the joint. Joints can be classified as fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial, depending on the structural articulations of the opposing bones. Fibrous joints include 2 types, syndesmoses and sutures. The syndesmosis joint permits only slight movement between the 2 bones, which are separated by a layer of fibrous connective tissue. The interosseous membrane between the radius and the ulna is an example. Sutures are joints like those between the flat bones of the skull. Here the individual bones interdigitate tightly along serrated edges, rendering them almost immovable. The fibrous tissue between these bones is continuous with the periosteum. Some believe that gentle manipulative techniques on the cranial sutures may be used to treat a myriad of health problems. However, it is now suggested that this concept is no longer accepted. Cartilaginous joints are represented by synchondroses and symphyses. Opposing bony surfaces of this group are united by cartilage. A synchondrosis is a temporary joint that will eventually be ossified into a bony component. The epiphyseal plate on the ends of the growing long bones is an example of this type of joint. A symphysis is a cartilage joint between two bones. It is located in the midline and is interposed between the fusion of the bones, as in the mandibular symphysis and the pubic symphysis. Synovial joints, the most abundant type in the body, afford the greatest degree of joint movement. The articular surfaces of the bones are covered by hyaline cartilage. The entire joint is in turn covered by ligaments forming an articular capsule, which is lined by synovial membrane. Occasionally, the joint is separated by an articular disc meniscus. This meniscus is continuous with the capsule peripherally, but its articular surfaces are not covered with synovial membrane. A variety of synovial joints exist in the body, each permitting only a particular type of movement. These movements are categorized using 6 different terms. Because most of these terms are not associated with the joints of the head and neck, they will be defined as discussion of individual joints requires. Articulations of the synovial joint are usually of a gliding or sliding character. The joint contains synovial fluid, which acts as a lubricant and also supplies nutrients to the avascular articular cartilage. Synovial joints are richly supplied with sensory nerve endings, principally of the proprioceptive variety, as well as with pain and stretch receptors. Articular capsules and ligaments are highly vascularized, forming capillary networks over the synovial membranes. Bone development, bone formation may occur in either of 2 ways, intramembranous bone formation or endochondral bone formation. During embryogenesis and postnatal growth, bone may develop in one of 2 ways. It may be formed directly in mesenchyme, in which case the mode is intramembranous. Most of the flat bones of the skull are formed in this manner. The other method of bone formation involves bone being elaborated on and replacing a cartilage template. This is endochondral bone formation and represents the manner in which long bones and most other bones of the body are formed. Intramembranous bone formation, begins in a highly vascularized region where mesenchymal cells develop into bone-forming cells. Intramembranous bone formation begins as the area destined to become bone becomes highly vascularized and the mesenchymal cells develop into osteoblasts. These bone-forming cells then begin secreting collagen and a matrix composed of mucoproteins, constituting the osteoid. These osteoblasts possess long cell processes that communicate with other osteoblasts and nearby blood vessels. At this stage, the osteoid is a rubbery, tough, somewhat elastic material as yet uncalcified. Mineral ions of calcium and phosphate, circulating in the blood, begin to diffuse into osteoid tissue and are deposited on the surfaces of collagen fibers as fine crystals. This imparts a hardness and rigidity to the osteoid in the process of becoming bone. Osteoblasts, cells that were responsible for secreting the matrix, become trapped in lacunae and are now renamed osteocytes. Endochondral bone formation, endochondrial bone formation takes place as bone cells invade and replace a cartilaginous template. Endochondral bone formation begins after a cartilage template has been formed in an area destined to become bone. The hyaline cartilage miniaturized model, which continues to grow while at the same time being replaced by bone, originally develops in mesenchyme in a fashion similar to that of intramembranous bone. Condensation of mesenchymal cells is followed by differentiation into chondroblasts, which secrete a new bone formation, whereas pressure activates resorption, Wolo's law. Cartilage, hyaline cartilage is at the growing ends of bone and the template for endochondral bone formation, fibrocartilage is in the intervertebral discs, and elastic cartilage is in the ear, auditory tube, epiglottis, and larynx. Any discussion of bone requires the mention of the articulating cartilages that serve as connective tissue at the joints. Cartilage is a supporting tissue that possesses a firm but somewhat pliable anatomy, permitting it to withstand compression and great stresses at the joints. Cartilage also serves as the template for endochondral bone formation and functions in long bone growth, as previously discussed. Although cartilage is formed in a fashion similar to bone, it is poorly vascularized and nervated. 3 types are recognized: hyaline, fibrous, and elastic. Hyaline cartilage is the type found in the cartilage template of long bones and at their growing ends. Hyaline cartilage is located also at the joints as articulating cartilage and may be found also in the tracheal rings and larynx. Fibrocartilage is present in the intervertebral discs, in the pubic symphysis, arid in the mandibular symphysis. Elastic cartilage occurs in the external ear, the auditory tube, the epiglottis, and some components of the larynx. The circulatory system is composed of two parts, the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic vascular system. The circulatory system is composed of two parts working in unison to maintain the internal environment. The heart, arteries, veins, capillaries, and blood comprise the cardiovascular system, whereas the lymph nodes, spleen, tonsils, thymus, lymph, and lymphatic vessels make up the lymphatic system. Cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is composed of the heart, arteries, veins, capillaries, and blood. The cardiovascular system functions to provide transportation of oxygen, water, nutritive materials, and hormones to the tissues of the body in exchange for carbon dioxide and wastes that will be further transported to excretory organs for elimination from the body. Blood, the fluid tissue of the cardiovascular system, is composed of cells and plasma. The cells are erythrocytes, red blood cells, and leukocytes, white blood cells. Erythrocytes, which are manufactured in red bone marrow, transport oxygen and carbon dioxide gases to and from the body tissues, respectively. Leukocytes, also manufactured in the bone marrow, are diverse in origin and function. Agranular leukocytes, which include lymphocytes and monocytes, originate in red bone marrow and lymphatic tissues. They function in the defense of the body and are especially well represented in the immune system. Granular leukocytes include eosinophils, neutrophils, and basophils. These cells are generally assigned the functions of protecting the body from outside invasion and combating infection. Blood platelets, formed elements also found in the blood, assist in coagulating the blood. The plasma, liquid portion of the blood, is composed of water, proteins, enzymes, and salts as well as the products of digestion and excretion. This fluid leaks out of the capillary walls, becoming the extracellular fluid, tissue fluid, bathing the cells with its contents and picking up wastes before its return to the circulatory system via either venous or lymph capillaries. The heart, arteries, veins, and capillaries comprise the closed system for the transportation function of the cardiovascular system. The heart is a double pump in that it serves two circuits for blood flow that are completely separated from each other in a normal healthy adult heart. The pulmonary circuit, located in the right side of the heart, receives venous, deoxygenated, blood in the right atrium from the body via the superior and inferior vena cava and from the walls of the heart via the coronary sinus. During muscular contraction, the pooled blood is pumped from the right atrium through the right atrioventricular, tricuspid, valve into the right ventricle. Blood in the ventricle is then pumped out the pulmonary trunk, which divides into right and left pulmonary arteries transporting the blood to the lungs for oxygenation and some excretion. Oxygenated blood returns from the lungs in the pulmonary veins to enter the left side of the heart in the left atrium. The blood is now in the systemic circuit, where it is pumped through the left atrioventricular bicuspid valve into the enlarged, very muscular left ventricle. From here, the blood will be pumped out of the aorta to be distributed by arteries throughout the entire body. Or two at a time. In the capillary bed, gases and nutrients are exchanged for wastes, whereas hormones and enzymes are delivered for body maintenance. Muscles in the walls of the vessels control the blood flow to the periphery, thus aiding in the control and management of body temperature and oxygen requirements. The cardiovascular system is under control of the nervous system. The rate and force of the heartbeat is modulated by the autonomic nervous system through the specialized cells within the heart musculature. These specialized cells have the innate capacity to perpetuate the rate of heartbeat, but the rate has to be modified by nerve impulses arising from the autonomic nervous system. The blood vessels, particularly the arteries, are also under control of the autonomic nervous system. Nerve impulses to the muscular walls of the arteries elicit either dilation or contraction of the vessel lumen, thereby increasing or decreasing the rate of flow. Specialized sensory mechanisms to monitor blood pressure and oxygen and carbon dioxide tension within the bloodstream are located in the carotid arteries within the neck. The carotid sinus, located at the beginning of the internal carotid artery, responds to changes in blood pressure. The carotid body, located at the bifurcation of the common carotid artery, is a chemoreceptor sensitive to changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide tension as well as hydrogen ion concentration within the blood. When stimulated, both of these specialized receptors, served by cranial nerves, evoke an autonomic response aimed at returning the system to homeostasis. Lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is composed of the lymph nodes, spleen, tonsils, thymus, lymph, and lymph vessels. The lymphatic system begins as an extensive system of capillary beds collecting the lymph, extracellular fluid, from the tissues. The capillaries empty into larger lymphatic vessels, and eventually the lymphatic vessels empty their contents into the bloodstream in the large veins at the base of the neck. Between the capillary beds and the point of entry into the bloodstream, the lymph passes through one or usually several lymph nodes, which act as filters. Here, lymphocytes reside in lymphoid nodules and in the paracortex and are propagated for circulation in the bloodstream to sites for combating foreign intrusion. Lymph capillaries within the small intestine, called lacteals, receive fatty products of digestion which are eventually transported to the bloodstream via the thoracic duct. In addition to the lymph nodes, the lymphatic system also includes the spleen, thymus, and tonsils, which are responsible for other lymphatic functions such as the filtering of blood and the maintenance of immunocompetence.